let me ask as we kind of move into our next message in the Road Out series, let me ask you a question. Have you ever found yourself in a place where you began questioning the very purpose of life? I'm talking about one of those kind of silly, hyper-philosophical moments. Usually they happen after you've had one drink too many, right? And you're like, man, what's the meaning of all this? It's one of those moments, but hopefully that's not the case, you know. That always happens for me. It annoys the heck out of my wife. It happens for me one day into a vacation. I'm driven by work. Everything for me is work, and she hates that. But we're one day into a vacation, and I start questioning my purpose, my value. I have no meaning in life. I have no purpose. She's like, you're on vacation. Your purpose is family. I'm like, that doesn't matter. I need work. It doesn't take long for me to start questioning the very meaning of this thing called life that we're journeying on. And in our Road Out series, we find ourselves in that place. We find ourselves in the place where the Israelites are asking that very question, what is the purpose, what is the meaning of this journey that we're on? I want to set the stage, and I want you to just imagine with me. 2 weeks ago, we started this series, right? And what we established was we began watching the journey of the Hebrew people, or this people group that eventually became the nation of Israel. And we established that they had a great working relationship with the nation of Egypt. And then all of a sudden, something changed, didn't it? All of a sudden, behind the back of the Hebrew people, the Pharaoh met with his key leaders and said, they're beginning to outnumber us. They're growing larger than we are. We need to beat these people into submission. And something radically changed for the nation of Israel. And that wasn't enough. They weren't just slaves, but all of a sudden, leadership of the Egyptians kicked in the doors to their homes and stole their baby boys and started throwing them into rivers. Think of that transition. But how did we end that first week? Do you remember? They cried out to God, and God knew that it was time to act. And in a moment of deep sorrow, in a moment of deep pain, God heard, and the train that was carrying this whole Exodus meta-narrative began moving because of their pain. Last week, Pastor Dan moved the story forward. We talked about how the Hebrew people were released from captivity, right? It wasn't just you served your time and the jail cell was open and they got to leave. But Moses challenged his brother, who was the Pharaoh. And we saw these crazy plagues, these crazy acts of God come upon the nation of Egypt. And then all of a sudden, a testimony or a history of 400 years of slavery was radically changed. And a nation, a people group was released. And then victoriously, the Lord turned an ocean into a highway, right? And they marched through and they turned around and watched that highway collapse on their enemies. And the Lord proved himself faithful to them. I mean, talk about a great movie, right? I'm sure there's movies on it, but they're all from like the 60s, 70s, so they're all awful in my eyes. Give me something new. Sorry. Talk about a great rags to riches moment. A moment where this nation is beaten into submission, and then all of a sudden the Lord steps in and he expands this ocean and allows them to walk through, and then it collapses on the people that are chasing them. That is a powerful moment. And what would we expect to come next in a movie like that? They exit the ocean and they enter a place of luxury, right? I mean, the Lord is clearly involved, and so it's not going to take long for them to walk into that paradise, that chosen land where they can just relax. I mean, after generations and generations and generations of abuse and slavery, they deserve nothing more than luxury and rest at this point. But is that what happens? That is not quite what happens for the nation of Israel. Rather, in Exodus chapters 16 to 19, which is where we're spending our time this morning, we find them in a place of physical starvation. The Lord paved the way for them to a place of physical starvation. The Lord paved the way for them to a place of physical dehydration. And we see the people of Israel, the Hebrew people group, experiencing spiritual expiration. Their spiritual trust of the Lord is fading away and dying. all of which leaves the Hebrew people in a state of confusion about the what, the why, and the how of the very purpose of God for their lives. Because they watched the Lord move in such a big way, and then all of a sudden they're journeying in the desert. And days turn into weeks, and weeks turn into months, and months turn into years, and they begin to question, why did we leave in such an awesome way, yet nothing is changing? That would make us all question the very purpose of life, wouldn't it? We see this thing happening for the nation of Israel. Last week, Pastor Dan brought us the rules of the road. We talked about that everybody's got to serve somebody. We all have a master, whether we know it or not. We're all serving something, whether we know it or not. Also, we established that the road to life is the same for all of us. There's one road out of whatever situation we're in, and that road is Jesus, right? And it's our duty, it's our job. By grace, we're called to stay on the path. We're called to stay on that path, on that road out, by grace. And so what I want to emphasize this morning is, how do we stay on that path? How do we stay on the road out? What are attitudes of the road out? Last week we talked about the rules of the road out. Today we're talking about attitudes of the road out. Attitudes or concepts of character that help us live out the very purpose of God, that help us stay on the road that keeps us moving towards the destination that the Lord is calling us to. But for me, the question still lingers, right? If we're going to talk about what are attitudes that keep us moving towards our purpose, we have to answer the question, what is the purpose, right? What is the thing that God has called us to? As is the case most of the time, a question like this, we don't find the answer out until it's too late, right? Until we've been moaning and complaining to God for days and days and days, and then he finally reveals the thing we need to know. That's just the normal human experience. And that was the case with the Israelites. But the cool thing is, as Christians today in the modern context, we're able to kind of stand outside of Scripture and see the meta-narrative as a whole, right? And so we can see things that the Israelites experienced before they knew they were going to experience, and we can kind of get a big picture in a way that people living in this moment didn't. So I want to look ahead for a quick moment and answer the question, what was the purpose for the nation of Israel? What was the thing that God was calling them to? You'll find that in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Look at that with me. Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. And this is God talking to Moses. Basically, the nation of Israel just entered the region of Mount Sinai. They're at the base of the mountain. And if you remember, Mount Sinai is where Moses had this divine experience with Yahweh, with God the Father, where we see the Ten Commandments actually written in stone, and God passes by, and Moses sees the very back of God. It's this very divine moment. So those things are happening soon, but this comes before. And God, talking to Moses, says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." The reality of the road is that God is always leading somewhere. God is always leading somewhere intentionally. Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 and 6 is where he was leading the nation of Israel. This was a promise specifically for that nation. This was a promise, this was a mission specifically for that people group at that time. It was where God was leading them. The question is, where is he leading us? How do we make that pivot? How do we make that adjustment for us today? He's not calling us as the United States of America to be a holy nation in the same way he was calling the nation of Israel. At that time, in the Old Testament context, we see things that are called God wars or holy wars. Basically what that means is it was one nation fighting against another nation, claiming that their God was the true God. And so God stepped in and he chose a race. He chose a nation and said, you are going to be the nation of the true God. You're going to represent me as a country, as a civilization, as a people group, so that the other nations would begin to see that I am the true God. That was the narrative of the Old Testament. That's not the same for us. The promises that were for the nation of Israel are not exactly promises that we can cling to and grab and claim as our own as the nation of America. However, he is in the same way challenging us and empowering us to be a people or a church filled with priests. I know that's a churchy word, maybe a scary word. But what that means is he's equipping us, he's empowering us to display the heart of God and point people to the love of Jesus. That's what this priesthood means. That we're called to be a group of people, a community of believers who are working and striving to display the heart of God and point people towards the love of Jesus. That's the mission today. The nation of Israel was called to that aim with the purpose of representing what it looked like as a nation. We're called to that aim individually for life in Christ for every Alaskan and the world beyond, right? That's our mission. That's our aim. So what kind of attitudes or concepts of character can we look at this journey in Exodus chapter 16 to 19? What types of attitudes do we see that we can apply to our own lives that help keep us on that road? That's the question we're going to answer. Does that make sense? You tracking with me? Okay, great. So the first attitude that we see is an attitude to gratefully recall. An attitude to gratefully recall. Look at Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Exodus 16, 1 through 3. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." How quickly do we forget? 2 months after the Lord turned an ocean into a highway, and generations, I mean, this was 400 years of slavery. Kids, teens, young adults, even old adults at that point were tasting freedom like they've never tasted before. It was an explosion out of slavery and an entrance into freedom in a way that they probably haven't even dreamed about. They never saw possible. And 2 months later, what are they doing? Begging to go back to the very thing that they desperately cried out to God to get them out of. How quickly do we forget? Not only were they formally grumbling against their very leaders, they're saying, clearly Moses has no clue where he's leading us. I'm sure that was easy for Moses to handle. Clearly our leaders don't have our best interest in mind, but they also complained against the very purpose of God. God, would it be that you would have just killed us in the land of Egypt, because clearly you don't have anything for us out here. How quickly do we forget? While focusing solely on the physical need, they neglected the spiritual journey that actually leads to the meta-narrative of Scripture as a whole, the person of Jesus. How quickly do we forget? I want to ask you just 2 really reflective questions. You don't have to answer, but just questions to think about. How often does our expectation of what God is going to do for us have us begging to go back to a previous life? How often does a false expectation of what God is going to do for us have us begging to go back to a previous life? Do we move from asking God for one giant miracle to another giant miracle, for another giant miracle, and then another giant miracle? Or is one move of God enough to keep us going, to keep us moving through a season of hardship? It reminds me of how we ended up buying our first home. And this is kind of a long story, so just bear with me for a moment. But how many of you remember buying your first home? Maybe you're not there yet. But for my wife and I, it was like, I don't know, for us it just feels cliche. Like it was a movie moment, something we had always hoped to do, and it was a weird, crazy season, and then all of a sudden it happened, right? And it was just super cool. But when we were starting to look at a home, we were in this really awesome little rental house in downtown Palmer. I was serving at Alaska Bible College, and randomly I come home one day, and my wife goes, "I think we should look for a home." And I kind of just laugh, because we're on mission support. And if you don't know what that means, it means basically we're missionaries, and we not only was our income really low, but it came in really weird. It didn't come in a stable way. It came in sporadically. So like when a bank would ask us how much you're making, we're kind of like, I don't know. And banks don't like that, which I don't like. They should be okay with that. Trust the Lord, bank, right? But we kind of just were talking about it and thinking through some of those things. And then all of a sudden, it was just happened circumstance. A new staff member came on at the school, and he was also a realtor here in the state. And so I emailed him one day. He was one of my bosses at the school. I emailed him. I said, "Hey, Ray, I'd like to just pick your brain about buying a home." And I told him very clearly, like, we're not in the financial place to do it. We've never done anything like it before, but we just want to ask some questions and kind of, we've never had taken out a loan or anything. So we didn't know anything about anything when it came to buying a home. And the email I got back from him was, download this MLS app, and I have 15 houses selected for you. Tell me when you're ready to start looking. So he just wanted our commission like that. No, I'm just joking. But basically he said, we'll talk about those things as we're looking at homes, and let's figure those things out together. And so we were mainly looking in downtown Palmer because we just love the heartbeat of Palmer. But the whole time we're like, yeah, we love this house, but there's no way. I mean, we got turned down by a couple financial institutions up here just because our income looked so weird. It came in separately and looked different each month, and so everyone thought we were drug dealers, which maybe we were, but I don't know. So we didn't think it would be possible at all for us to get into a home. Then one day, our realtor recommended us to call this lender out of Seattle. She is a hero. I don't know if what she did was illegal. I'm assuming it was because it worked. But somehow she got us a loan, and we just don't talk about it anymore. Like, let's move beyond that illegal moment of our lives where she made up how much money we made or something. What? It's true, though. She got us the loan. I don't know how it happened. She got us the loan. It was a miraculous moment. But then all of a sudden, we were working through, and she said, and you guys just have to come up with a $7,000 down payment. And I don't know what came out of I don't know why it came out of my mouth. I said, yeah, no problem, we got that. And I'm like, we don't have even close to $7,000. So we just we had about 2 months to come up with $7,000. I think it was like 2 months, 60 days, yeah. And so we just kept pretending we had it, when in reality we didn't have even close to it. So we were like wasting everyone's time. But we're like, the worst thing that can happen is we waste people's time and we stay in our rental house. So we're just kind of believing and stepping forward and seeing. You're learning a lot about us right in this moment, I think. But do you remember your first home? I mean, when we were in that 60-day period of hoping, of believing, we would drive by that house at least once a day. It was like a mile from our rental house, and we'd like creepily drive by. Thankfully, no one was in it at that time, or else they would have called the police on us for sure. We'd creepily drive by, and we'd just dream about our daughter Adeline, who we had at that time, running around the yard, right? We'd dream about a dog in the fenced-in yard, and it has this big detached garage, and I just dreamed of the manly things I could do in that garage, which I still haven't done. But we dreamed, and we dreamed, and we dreamed. But we didn't think it was possible. And it just happened, it was tax season, and one day I went to our mailbox and opened up, and we had a letter in there from one of our supporters. And I didn't know what to expect, but the emotions started to happen and come as we read that the Lord had told him that it was time for him to give his whole tax reimbursement to us. And we thought, oh man, that's spectacular, that's awesome, that's super cool. And then out dropped an $8,000 check. And in a moment of total emotions, it was stumbling trying to call my wife of saying, I think we're going to get this house, you know? I think we're going to get this house. And it's an emotional story that we try to bring up all the time, especially when we hate the house. Remember how cool it was when this happened, right? But what do you think happened? I mean, when we got in the house and we love it, and that first year, it seemed like it went by so fast because we were just first-time home buyers and embracing everything it had. But what do you think happened the first time something went wrong in the house? You guys laugh like I'm an awful person. I said, Lord, thank you for this house. Thank you for the dead furnace. Thank you that I have to dump out more money and pay for this stupid furnace. That's what I said. No, that's not what I said at all, right? I said, Lord, geez, thanks for leading us to this trash heap. Thanks for leading us to this money hole. Lord, wouldn't it be nice if we went back to renting again? And we didn't have to think about this stuff, and the landlord covered it all. All of a sudden, it was this moment of ignoring the amazing thing God had done for us, and wishing that we could go back to the thing before. There's certainly some truth to those statements. Sometimes when your furnace goes out, it'd be nice to be a renter, right? There's truth to that. But when we refuse to have an attitude towards gratefully recalling the things God has done, what we actually do is we discredit the very thing God did for us. We discredit the very thing God did for us, and that leads us away from a grateful heart towards what he's done for us. You see, it's not a matter of if God will provide. We know, most of us know that God will provide. The challenge, the tension comes in on our contentment with what he does provide. You know how easy it is to look up other houses and wish we would have gotten into that house, right? You see, for the nation of Israel, they complained that they were hungry, but manna wasn't enough. They wanted to go back to slavery for the meat pots and the full of bread. Manna wasn't enough. It's not a matter of if God will provide. It's a matter of our contentment with what God does provide. You see, attitude adjustment number one of staying on the road out is a grateful recollection of God's work in our lives. It's gratefully saying, Lord, I know what you've done, and I'm so thankful for that. I'm not going to complain about the things you've chosen to do for me. It's not letting new stresses or trials cause doubt in our lives or forgetfulness of the awesome act of God in our lives. Attitude number two is an attitude to faithfully follow. An attitude to faithfully follow. Look at Exodus 19, verses 7 to 9. 19, 7 to 9. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all the words that the Lord had said. Verse 8, and all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. When Moses told the words of the Lord, told the words of the people to the Lord. I grew up snow machining in Michigan. We'd go up every year. It was kind of an entrance into manhood in my family. My dad didn't really do a whole lot, but the one thing he did do was religiously, he and his best friend from work, they'd take a week off of work and they'd go up to our cabin in northern Michigan, which had a couple sleds in the garage, and they'd go spend a week out on the trails in the garage. That was the one thing my dad got into. And so when I was a preteen and then pivoting into a teenager, like when I was too young, I remember my older brother stepping up and going, and he like became a man in our house because of that. And I was always nervous about riding, and I'm just not wired that way necessarily. But it was a pressure, like I felt I needed to go do that. And I'm so glad I did, and that became part of the normal tradition in my home that all the guys would go and do riding. But if you know anything about snow machining in Michigan, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of trails. I mean, the state maintains these trails because it's such a large tourist industry in the state of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. It's all trail riding out there. There's not a thing called powder in Michigan. There's not a thing called high marking in Michigan, right? So I don't know if it was a good idea or not, but I decided to follow Mark Pratt into the woods last weekend. And we went out to the Graham's cabin, and it was an awesome experience. We did about 130 miles in one day. It was a day full of riding. I mean, we saw a ton of moose. There was a wolf. It was crazy cool. Mark was so mad. He tried to hit this wolf with the sled, and he missed it, and he was so mad. It was hilarious. But I decided I'm going to faithfully follow Mark Pratt through a shortcut that ended up being about, it felt like an hour. Mark, you may have to correct me. I don't know how long it was, but it felt like an hour of deep, no, it was deep powder riding. I mean, it was like 4.5 foot, right, of powder. That was awful. It was the worst experience of my life. Like, I feel like I can keep up with a lot of riders, but then as soon as he veered off, I'm like, no, this is the worst experience of my life. So I have 3 takeaways from my trip, okay? First one is don't follow Mark into a shortcut. It's that simple. Don't trust him. Don't follow him into a shortcut. Secondly, faithfully following will lead us into uncomfortable places. Faithfully following will lead us into uncomfortable places. We did quite a bit of riding up until that moment, and I was enjoying every bit of it. I mean, we saw a bunch of moose. That was super cool, and we were on trails. We were following this big snowcat trail, so it was nothing difficult. I mean, it was just ripping through the woods, and it was a lot of fun to try my best to keep up with Mark. But all of a sudden, we came to this difficult place. And knowing the heart of Mark and who he is, he didn't take me off trail to get me to fail. Maybe he did, I don't know. I like to believe he didn't take me off trail to watch me burn and die, to watch me fall off the sled. His motive was pure, wasn't it? His motive was, let's get to the cabin even faster than what we thought we could. Let's get to the cabin even faster. But what happened was, it doesn't take long in my mind and in all of our minds to very quickly believe when we come to an uncomfortable place, God, you want me to fail. God, you're testing me. You are testing me. You're testing me. You're testing me only so that you can watch me fail, and then I realize my need for you. I want to remove that burden from your life. That's not the heart of God. You see, we serve a God who's not out there bringing us to uncomfortable situations to test and test and test us. What happened because of that uncomfortable place on a machine was I became a more capable rider. No, I don't want to go back in powder. I'm not there yet. But I have a little bit of an understanding now, which before I didn't. I became more capable. I became more apt to handle a diverse situation on a snow machine. That's the heart of God. He brings us to uncomfortable situations because he wants us to grow. He wants us to flourish. He wants us to be more capable as priests, as ministers of his gospel, as people who are walking around displaying his light and pointing people to his love. Faithfully following will lead us to uncomfortable places. The other takeaway is that faithfully following a trustworthy leader will always get us to our destination. Faithfully following a trustworthy leader will always get us to our destination. For those of you who don't know, Mark Pratt ran the Iron Dog. I mean, he's as stable, he's as trustworthy, he's as steady on a snow machine as anyone out there. I'm not. I think I'm getting there maybe, hopefully, but I'm not there. But he is. And when we came to a point, it was about, I'll say it again, an hour of deep powdering through a shortcut. We came to this portion of river that hadn't been crossed before, and I think Mark could see the sheer terror in my eyes. Like, what are we doing? John, be thankful you weren't there this time. He said, we're going to cross this uncrossed part of river, but it was powder, and there were some ice ledges and stuff, and I said, I don't know really about that. And so thankfully, he pulled a Mark move and just zoomed off and let me figure it out on my own. No, that's not what happened. What he said was, I'm going to go really slow. You just stay in my tracks and follow where I go. And to me, he represented the heart of a godly leader. You see, God doesn't get us to these places of difficulty to test us, watch us fail, and then say, peace out, you figure this out on your own. I think Mark displayed the heart of God in that moment. We get to these uncomfortable places, and I feel like enough is enough, but then there's just another thing that stresses me out and adds more. It's more of an adventure and more of a faith step for me, and he slows down even more, and he says, I'm going to pave the way. You don't have to go alone. I'm not even going to pick up my pace. I will slow down for you, and I will set the track. You just keep your skis where I put my skis and follow me along. You see, God is our faithful and stable help, but we also know that he's very, what? Present. He's there. He doesn't abandon us in times of difficulty. He remains even closer, and he paves the way. Basically, I'm saying Mark is Jesus on a snow machine, okay? No. The attitude of faithfully following comes out of the understanding of who we're following. We're only able to faithfully follow if we understand the character of the person we're following. The character of the person we're called to follow. The one who cares, the one who's stable, who's steady, and is worthy of our trust. It's only by a deep and intimate understanding of who we're following that we can say the very thing the nation of Israel said in chapter 19, verse 8. All that the Lord says, we'll do. And wouldn't it be amazing if that was the heartbeat of our church? All that the Lord says, we'll boldly do. Even if it means an hour of deep powder riding. We'll do it. So first, we've got to have an attitude to gratefully recall the things that God has done. We have to cultivate that culture in our hearts. Secondly, we've got to have an attitude to faithfully follow wherever he leads. But as we read more about the person, the character of Moses, just following wasn't enough. Moses displays what it means to have an attitude to passionately pursue. That's our third attitude, to passionately pursue. Look at Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19, verses 18 to 20. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of a trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Just think about that scene for a moment. Not only God answering you in the voice of thunder, but think about the scene. You're at the base of this mountain, and all of a sudden clouds are stirring. Darkness is looming. You hear the earth shaking. It's the biggest earthquake you've felt. Everything around you is trembling. Trumpet noises are getting louder and louder. We're thinking we definitely had one too many at that point, right? But all of a sudden, Moses steps up and he says, "What up?" I mean, he says a "what up" to God. Like he knew what was going on while everyone else is horrified, backing down, shrieking in fear. Moses says, "Hey." That's how relational he was with God the Father in that moment. He had such a relationship with God where he knows that everything else that people were concerned about, he knew it was the Lord moving and stirring. We see more examples of this in Exodus chapter 40. If you have a moment, turn there. Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 to 38. Then the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of the meeting because the cloud settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out till that day, or the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. They watched, they waited, and they passionately pursued the very presence of God. If that's not enough, look at Exodus chapter 33. Exodus chapter 33, verse 15. This is a verse probably most of us have heard before. Exodus chapter 13, verse 15. And he said to him, this is Moses talking to God, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us out of here." Man. He challenges God. God says, "I'm going to send an angel with you." And Moses says, "No, that's not enough. If your very presence does not go with us, I don't want to go." An unwillingness to move without his presence. How often do we move without the presence of God? How often do we buy a home, buy a car, make a job transition without God going with us? I mean, I don't want to hyper-spiritualize those things, but that was the heart of Moses. We're not moving without your presence being in the midst. We're living amidst a cultural truth that interest and excitement dies over time. If you don't believe me, just look at the trend of leasing cars. Look at the trend of phone contracts. And I'm not dissing anyone who has any of those things. I have a phone contract because I love a new phone every couple of years. So I'm with you. But we live in such a culture that a 2-year-old car isn't enough. And so we get bored with it and we want to jump in with something new. Once again, I'm not throwing shade at anyone here. But that's our culture. Think about your marriage. I tell you what, the first year of marriage is probably the most spicy time of life, isn't it? For a lot of us at least. Hopefully for you, your first year of marriage was steamy as all get out, because that's the way it should be. But what happens over time? Kids happen, right? I don't mean just kids. Years go by. Kids happen. Ugly things happen. Mistakes happen. Lies are told, right? Things happen in life, and all of a sudden the excitement and the interest begins to just fade away. And in a scary way, the same thing happens routinely for our relationships with Jesus. When we were first saved, I don't know about your story, but we can be on fire for the Lord for a little while when we're first saved. Like nothing's cooler than how the Lord spoke to us that first time. If you're anything like me, I grew up going to youth camps every summer. And those were spiritual highs for me every single summer. Like I felt the presence of God. It was an awesome thing. And then very quickly, or eventually, those feelings just faded away. And the excitement and the devotion and the dedication faded away. Life happens. Maybe we come to Christ all excited and then some of our prayers go unanswered and our excitement fades away. Maybe we come to Christ all excited and then somehow things didn't magically get easier like we thought they would just because we chose Jesus. And our excitement fades away. We begin asking, is this really worth all the work we're putting into it? For just a moment, place yourselves in the shoes of Moses and consider how much he might be pondering that same question. Is this worth all the work I'm putting into it? The Lord shows up to him and says, I want you to lead your people out of captivity. A captivity that they've been in for 400 years. And Moses boldly and kind of reluctantly, he says, yeah, okay, I'm up for it. And then what happens? Man, he experiences the Lord move in mighty ways. He watches crazy plagues happen. A bunch of frogs come into a city. A bunch of gross bugs come into a city. All these crazy things that the Lord does. And then in a climactic way, he shoves a staff into an ocean, and the Lord turns it into a highway, right? Imagine the Lord moving through you in that way. And then imagine wandering through the desert for days and weeks and months and years and not understanding the purpose of the Lord. In the midst of it all, you're the leader of the people who's wandering in the desert for days and weeks and months and years. And they're grumbling against you. They hate you. They're challenging you. They think you're the reason that they're lost in the desert. How easy would it be to just say, I'm done with this? I can go be lost in the desert by myself, right? How easy would it be? But while the nation of Israel wandered and wandered away from God, Moses faithfully followed. He faithfully followed because of his passionate pursuit of presence, the passionate intimacy of relationship that he experienced with God, not once at a youth camp and then let it fade away, but again and again and again, because he was devoted to not moving without the presence of the Lord. And that kept him on the road out. He didn't lose excitement. He didn't lose his passion. You see, in our own lives, the more we intimately experience the presence of God, the more peace, the more joy, the more excitement and contentment we'll experience. Now notice I didn't say understanding. We still won't have understanding of why things happen. We still may be like the Israelites, wandering in the desert for years and saying, why in the world am I here? We may not gain understanding, but what we will gain is peace. What we will gain is joy, trust, and the thing we all thirst for, contentment in life. Here's the really exciting result. Okay, track with me. When we have an attitude to gratefully recall what God has done, When we have that attitude, it'll help us have an attitude to faithfully follow wherever he leads, which will lead us to the heart of an attitude to passionately pursue his presence day in and day out. And all of which will bring us to the destination of living as priests, working to see life in Christ for every Alaskan. You see, it's these three attitudes that really help us before every Alaskan. It's these three attitudes that keep us on the road of being for the valley, of being for the next generations, of being for marriages, for parents. It's these attitudes that keep us out of grumbling against the negatives and being focused on the positives, focused on the things we can fight for in our life here on earth. It'd be easy to hear a message like this or to think on a topic like this and just think we need to modify our behavior. All we need to do is adjust to the things we're doing, but that's not even the heart of God. The heart of God in this story, in this part of the narrative of Exodus, is actually because it's paving the way to the law. It's paving the way to the Ten Commandments where the actual culture of the people changes. They're not just changing what they do, but the heartbeat of who they are shifts. I want you to look at 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 10. But you are a chosen race. You're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. There's a newness. It's not just shifting behavior. It's a new culture. It's a new heartbeat of who we are. Turn to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 to 17. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. Here's the key. Verse 17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is what? A new creation. The old has passed away, and behold, the new has come. The old passing away signifies something bigger than just behavioral modification. It signifies a new heartbeat, a heartbeat of being for the things of God. Not just against the things that go against the grain of God, but really being for the things of God and wanting to see those not only happen in our lives, but in the lives of the valley and the lives of those around us. So here's my pastor's challenge for you this morning. The first one is really practical. It's really easy. You can do it. Set a time in your schedule to weekly recall the good things God has done for your family. Take a moment weekly to say this is our time of gratitude. Maybe it's around Friday dinner every single week. However it's best for your family, set a time where you, your spouse, your kids, or just you individually, you can say, man, what has the Lord done for us this week? What miracles have we seen this week? Begin an intentional shift in your perspective towards one of thankfulness. Now, the second one is a little mysterious. It's a little strange. It's broad, but I like it that way. So don't complain to me that it wasn't specific enough. Every day this week, embrace the presence of God. Something cool happens when we become comfortable with what's uncomfortable. Or when we just slow down enough and say, I'm okay with not knowing everything. I'm okay with understanding that God is bigger than me, and I won't ever understand fully who he is. Slow down this week and embrace the mysterious, unknown, maybe strange and emotional presence of God. I don't know how to tell you how to do that or what would work best for you, but just ponder that, journal about that this week. Be okay with the unknown and the mysterious and enter into an intentional relationship with God. So many things that happened in the life of Moses, we'd say he's a druggie for, right? The burning bush moment? No, you didn't see that. Embrace the mysterious. Embrace the unknown things of the Lord and see what happens.